Okay. So, first of all, how's everybody doing with um, their respective lockdowns? Everybody okay?
Yeah, it's everything's going pretty good with me.
Yeah. How's Publix treating you?
It's pretty good, hasn't been too busy, so it's pretty easy to stay safe and stuff.
Right. You got toilet paper back?
No, no, we're still out of all that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah. How's everybody else doing? Everybody okay? I guess so. Emma, are you okay? Are you up with your parents?
Yes, I
Oh,
am.
okay, good. All right. Um, okay. So, first of all, sorry about Monday. I had a really terrible, terrible migraine and I couldn't even I thought I did somehow my delirium make a post, but then I didn't realize till later I actually didn't. Um when somebody emailed me, I was in terrible pain. But anyway, so this chapter, we're talking about political economy of development. And so let's see, the kinds of questions that we would ask in relation to that is what is development and why does it matter? What should the role of the state be in the development process? What explains the ability of states to pursue development in the context of globalization? And what types of regimes are able to pursue development more effectively and why? So, development can really be a tricky concept. Okay, so remember when we were talking about modernization theory, um, uh, it was kind of uh, patronizing, right? And they talked about like third world and all of that. And it enabled those third world countries uh, to become um, no, it was enabling third world countries to become wealthy, right? Like what Western countries, um, to make them industrialized and urbanized, right? The capabilities approach, this is a little bit different. Um, it focused on the development of human capabilities and freedom. Um, Only when people are free politically in democracies can they define for themselves what a fulfilling life would be. This is according to San and 1999, page 584, 586. So what he was talking about, right, was that um, uh, it was very different from the from the modernization theory, right? So, modernization theory, let's go and take a step back, right? Um, Modernization theory, as we talked about previously, it focused on this notion that countries, um, uh, it was very patronizing, and it was this notion that countries needed to look more like the West, right? And but it was kind of unfair, right? Because uh, you know those countries, they, it was expecting countries to quickly go through this process, right? That took Western countries like hundreds of years to go through, right? Particularly like England and the United States, right? And like France and, uh, the other European countries, right? Um, and, uh, it also meant by default that these nations, right, were somehow backward and incapable. Um, uh, and, of course, these countries um, sort of resented this notion. There was, of course, this assumption that these countries were going to go through this process much faster, right? And the way that they were going to do this was that the West knew best, and they were going to go through this process because the West had been there, right? And they were going to give them aid, right? Um, and so critics wondered, right? Well, does the West really know best, right? Um, there were different circumstances, right, that are going on in these countries in Latin America, in Africa, right? You can't, kind of like what Montesquieu had talked about before, right? About how you can't just um, take in institutions and these sort of concepts and just plant them on different places, right, and just assume that they're going to work, right, and not only different places but different times, right, you know um 1950s and 60s, say Guatemala or um you know Brazil or Zimbabwe or whatever is not, um, you know, the like 1800s England or, you know, 1800s United States, right? There's different circumstances. Okay. It's not the same thing at all. And so to try to pretend that those are the same things and have those same sort of expectations, right? That you're going to have the same type of results um, just doesn't seem correct. Okay. Um, so, what critics thought is that the focus should be on, reducing poverty as opposed to generating wealth. Okay. For Sen, he didn't think that the focus should be on reduction of poverty or generating wealth. Okay. He thought that you needed to focus on those things that would enhance the capabilities of individuals. Okay. That economic growth, all of those things would reduce poverty, yes, but he felt that healthy and educated people um, uh, were the most free, right? And that really you should be focused on producing that human capital. And when people are, uh, when they felt that they were pursuing those things that they were best at, and those things that mattered to them personally, right? When they could maximize their own capabilities, that uh, they would be able to fulfill themselves, and therefore, and by turn, I mean, the state would. um, fulfill itself. Okay. Development is freedom, is what he called it. Okay. Um, and that, hold on a second, just one second. Okay. Um, and he also thought that, um, like, you shouldn't focus on gender norms for jobs, right? So, like, a lot of um, developing, um, a lot of development. I'm sorry. Hold on a second. Stop it. This is aggravating. A lot of development was focused on in the past, right? Especially in the 50s and 60s, was focused on making, like, if there were jobs for teachers, that they should be women, right? If there were jobs for doctors, they should be men. If there were jobs for nurses, they should be women. Okay. But, you know, Sen didn't believe that, right? His attitude was, if men feel like, that their talents would be best served by being teachers, that that's what they're passionate about, then let them be teachers, right? If women have the capability to be scientists and doctors, right, let them be doctors. If they have the capability to be a car mechanic, right, let them be a car mechanic. And that this is how society will be best served, right? By letting people pursue, um, their own, their education to wherever it leads them, right? And maximizing those capabilities. This became sort of the basis for the Human Development Index, the HDI, health, education, income. Many people, or many, but not all theorists, see democratic regimes with strong institutions as most likely to provide conditions for the greatest development in human capabilities. Okay, so I'm sorry, I have this terrible dry cough. So, the global relationship between wealth and life expectancy, that's what this chart is, right? So, the red dots show Asia, the blue dots show Africa, the yellow dots show Europe, and the green dots show the Americas, okay, which include South America, right, and North America. So if you look at, this is income per person's GDP per capita, and this is life expectancy in years. Okay. Um, and so the data are from 2015. Okay. Um, so this is for the year 2015, right? And so, you know, the lowest are in Africa, as we can see. Okay. The next we can see is from Asia, right? Like Afghanistan here, right? And they don't say which one this is right here, but this is Afghanistan. All right. Um, so it's like Africa and Asia here. This is India. Now, what they don't say is that the dots get bigger by population. Okay, so like India has one of the largest has like the one of the largest populations in the world, right? So that's why the dot is so big. China has the largest population in the world. So they have the biggest dot, right? So here's China here. Um, Mexico is this green dot right here. This is Iran, okay? This is Russia. Okay, it's the biggest country in the world, but it's not the biggest population. I'm sorry. Where's that? Here it is, right here. Um, this is Japan. This is the United Kingdom. All right. Germany is in here. The United States. All right. And then here's Qatar. All right. Um, they have like one of the greatest life expectancies, and but also um, they have the highest GDP per capita. All right. So let's see. So that's just kind of interesting. Um, let's see. So, um, development and globalization, just a few terms to know. Foreign direct investment, that's investment from abroad in productive activity in another country by definition. Trade, that's flow of goods and services across national borders. It's obvious, right? International capital flows, that's movements of capital in the form of money across international borders. Some of these terms may be obvious, but they're good to know. The development debate. So, this is related to the Keynesian and neoliberal debate. Okay. Um, so it's somewhat based on this notion of comparative advantage. Some of you, if you've had economic classes, you may have heard this notion of comparative advantage. By definition, it's theory of trade that argues that economic efficiency and well-being will be maximized if each country uses its resources to produce whatever it produces relatively well compared with other countries, then trades its own products with other countries for goods it does not produce. Okay, so um, uh, now over the past few years, they've been really focused on, like I've talked about previously, um, neoliberalism, right? And that has created a larger gap between the rich and the poor. So that's economic growth and reduction of poverty has varied widely by region. But the IMF and the World Bank, we're going to go back in time, how they were created at Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire um, through the United Nations in July of 1944. They established a framework of economic cooperation that led to a more stable, prosperous global economy. Um, all countries, the idea was that all countries would gain because they are using resources efficiently. Poor agrarian countries produce uh, agricultural products and raw materials if they use comparative advantage. Um, and I'm sorry, poor agrarian countries produce agricultural products and raw materials and new and not compete they're because they're new and not compete well against more industrial wealthy countries. So the idea was that, these Latin American countries and African countries, that they should be the agrarian countries, right? because that's what they do well, right? They haven't industrialized yet, right? So what they need to focus on is what they do well, right? This notion of comparative advantage. Um, and if they were to fully industrialize right then, they wouldn't be able to compete, and they would just collapse economically. And so the notion was that they would kind of go through if you kind of remember the modernization theory um, chart, right, that kind of looked like this, but at a somewhat accelerated pace, right, where they would start to build small industry, right, and then kind of go through that, right? So they would have small industry that they would sell kind of like within their countries and stuff, right? But that would kind of be it, right? And sort of work on perfecting their industry, if that makes sense. Okay. So, ah, hold on a second. Ugh, this is so aggravating. Put this here. Put this here. Import substitution industrialization, ISI, that was a development policy. And it was popular in the 50s and 70s based on Keynesianism. It uses trade policy and monetary policy and like currency rates to encourage creation of new industries to produce goods domestically that the country imported in the past. They used it in countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey. It was initially successful, ultimately hurt by oil prices, debt, and inefficient industries. Um, so, of course, these countries um, in the global south, right, they didn't want their countries to be stuck producing agricultural goods, right? They didn't want their countries to be stuck being backward, okay, as like a third world country, underdeveloped, these various terms that we talked about that they were initially being called, right? So, they didn't want to be stuck being predated on, um, you know, by the developed world, sucking them from their, sucking the raw materials off of them, right? So there was this new field of development economics um, that talked about how a state could intervene to stimulate rapid industrialization and growth. Um, and t- this idea came from early ideas in development, being about economic growth, industrialization, all of that, as well as Keynesian theory and the state managing capitalistic growth. And it would look more like managing uh, managing industrialization in sort of like developing countries. Um, However, it began a debt crisis in 1982 as countries could no longer pay debts as inflation grew, right? So basically, what they did was they started loaning money to these countries as they started to industrialize, right? So, like how I was talking about how they wanted to, when I was talking about like the modernization theory and sort of like rapidly, trying to make that happen on a faster timeline, right? What they were trying to do was make that happen on a fast timeline, but in order to do that, they had to take out loans, right, from the IMF and the from the World Bank, right? But the problem was there was the um, global gas crisis, right, in the 70s, and that affected everybody. It had a global impact, right? And so countries started to not be able to pay their debts to the World Bank, right? It caused like global stagnation everywhere. And so inflation started to grow and all of that. And it put these countries in a bad way, right? So they came up with this alternate program, um, structural adjustment programs, SAPs. Okay. So these development programs created in the 1980s based on neoliberal principles of reduced government protection of industries, fiscal austerity, and privatization. Expansions for only explanations um, for only partial successes, failure of effective implementation, because some of them only were partially successful. Okay. Failure of would and the way they explained their partial successes were failure of effective implementation, work in specific circumstances, um, fundamentally flawed, hurt human capital. Let me explain what all that means. Right. So the growing issues with the ISIs were emerging as policymakers were shifting from the Keynesian to neoliberal ideas, becoming increasingly skeptical about government being able to manage the market, right? So remember in Keynesian policies and stuff, the government um, were the ones to step in and sort of help manage what was going on. So the IMF, the World Bank started becoming increasingly skeptical about this notion. So they adopted these neoliberal policies, right? So there was this East Asian miracle, and we kind of talked about this a little bit last chapter, right? They noted that South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, they had never adopted ISI, right? Or abandoned it early on in favor of focusing on exports. Or abandoned it early on. Instead, they focused on exports, and they were competitive, right? So the neoliberals, they were like, oh, well, maybe that's what we should do, right? They said that they were poor and no different. Um, they said that poor countries should act no different than the rich ones and follow the same principles. Okay, and economists um, came up with this SAP notion. Okay. So, and what it was basically reduce deficits, allow for comparative advantage, and the market to signal how resources should be invested. Okay. And which would maximize efficiency and therefore economic growth. All right. Um, then in 1982, the debt crisis forced many to go to the IMF and ask for more loans. Okay. The IMF and the World Bank demanded countries implement SAPs, imposing this model on the global south, resulting in high inflation. All right. It ultimately led to really high unemployment in these countries. Okay. um, Drastic cuts in government programs to these countries, including education and healthcare. Um, and their answer to this was, no pain, no gain. You've got to do this in the short term in order to get a long term benefit. All right. The only country that this was somehow successful in was Chile. All right. Um, and in a couple of the Southeast Asian countries, right? But on the whole, there really wasn't a lot of successes. All right. Policies prior to SAP were helping them actually catch up, but once SAP was implemented, they grew much more slowly than what might have actually made things worse, or at best, in some cases, did nothing to help. So what that means is that before SAP was implemented, um, those specific policies were working, right? And if you look at them on a timeline, like a time series, those countries had been growing like, you know, 3%, you know, like each year or something like this, right? They had consistently been growing, right? Obviously, until this, world problem had occurred, right? But uh, when SAP was implemented, right, that's when the problems really started to occur for these countries, right? So they actually either did nothing to help, okay, or they made things worse than they were before. So rather than causing the countries to grow, okay, they were actually declining in growth. They were going backward, all right, which was unfortunately the case for many countries, particularly in Africa. It was much, much worse, and some countries in Latin America. All right. Um, Regionally, the differences were much more stark in East Asia. Okay. They grew much more rapidly than were on the average. On the other hand, Africa suffered economic contraction, and Latin America contracted in the 80s and saw very slow growth in the 90s. Poverty mirrored in growth. Okay. So, um, as poverty, as economic growth um, contracted, okay, so did poverty. Poverty grew, okay, and as economic growth started to happen, like at a snail's pace, okay, poverty started to retract at a snail's pace, right? Um, and that's in Latin America, right? It was cut in half over 2 decades. However, um, that took place almost entirely in East Asia and South Asia. Okay. The number of people living in poverty overall actually increased in Africa and Latin America. And the decline in South Asia was very slight. All right. Um, those SAPs were modeled after South Korea, right? Because they had done very well, and Taiwan. Um, they actually didn't follow a neoliberal model at all. Okay. Um, those who did were Latin America, right? They followed the neoliberal model and they suffered. Okay. Um, Failure. So going back to these explanations, right? So the IMF and the World Bank, they were like, well, the reason why um, Latin America and Africa and everybody had a problem was because they failure of effective implementation. Um, and so uh, the question becomes, is that really the case? Or was it the failure of political will of leaders to implement? Was that the case? Or was it really, something else? Was there something more um, going on there? Was it that there was a problem with the thing itself, right? Um, what about taking specific circumstances into account, right? Weak states, which these states were, they tend to, as we know, right, have weak institutions, okay? Typically, in situations like that, states can't be so sure that their investments, their property, their contract rights will be protected, right? And so, what happens commonly is known as a flock of geese, right? When one investor will leave because they get spooked by something, right? Then others will follow, right? This is what happened in East Asia, right? When the East Asian miracle had actually collapsed, right? And that's not uncommon. It happens in other places around the world. Okay. Um, Fundamentally flawed. Um, that was another thing, um, that it hurts human capital. Um, Actually, in many of these places, um, you know, they, for example, East Asia, right? They already provided what investors wanted. They had um, a healthy, educated workforce. Okay. So, but Latin America and um, Africa did not, right? So when you look at the circumstances, right, um, uh, Latin America and Africa they already had um, an educated workforce, right? Very educated workforce, whereas Latin America and Africa did not, right? Um, they were more politically stable, right? Um, and, uh, you know, the collapse of or this flock of geese thing that happened, that didn't happen until much later, right? In the 90s. Um, so, you know, again, trying to um, do this sort of one size fits all scenario with institutions, right? And assume that what looks like it might work in one place and say it's going to work in another place doesn't quite work. You have to look at all of the um, antecedent conditions, the various variables, and see what you know these comparative situations, right? What was happening um, in Asia versus, like in Japan, in Taiwan, in South Korea, right? And try to compare that to Latin America, to Africa, and see the difference, right? You can't make those comparisons across every country, right? So obviously it wasn't the same, right? And so you can't expect the same results. Okay. Um, Developmental states. So they encouraged export-oriented growth. Um, States guide development to new industries producing goods and services for export, usually starting with light manufacturing such as textiles, maintained a sort of neoliberal economic policies. They were hurt by the 1997-98 East Asian financial crisis. And this goes back to what we were talking about with that sort of investor flight. Investors come in and then pull out. Um, and that creates a sort of financial contagion. What happened in this particular circumstance, what I was talking about with this investor flight that happened in the 1990s, um, it began kind of in Thailand, right, where um, uh, Thailand devalued the baht, which is their currency, right? Um, this spooked investors. I don't remember if it was Microsoft or I think it was Microsoft or I forget who the first investor was that pulled out. Was it Oracle or it was one of those like big tech companies, right? Um, they were like the first one to get like really spooked and was like, I'm outie. Okay. And um, then once one goes, others go, right? So because they see that big company go and they're like, they must know something that we don't, right? And so it spooks the others. Okay. And so the other companies in that region, right, in the South Asian, like sort of economic region, right, started to just bail. Okay. Um, and that really hurt the Southeast Asian economy in these developmental states. And they had a very difficult time recovering. Okay. So Japan is one of the developmental states, and we'll talk about them a little bit later as an example of what they tried to do to recover. So the the pink tide in Latin America. So Latin America was influenced again by the neoliberal model by the National Monetary Fund. Of course, there were leftist critics of the neoliberal reforms who came into power in the early 2000s. This varied most preserved neo-macro economic policies. Okay, they preserved neoliberalism, but at the same time, um, um, they tried to push anti-poverty programs. Okay, so and we'll talk about what that means in just a minute. In doing so, they reduced poverty and inequality substantially. There was strong growth until collapse of natural resource prices. So again, we talked about that there was this debt crisis that began in 1982. It began particularly in Mexico and Latin America, again, because of the gas prices and all of that. They began to not be able to pay back their loans. It spread to Brazil and Argentina, um, and this became known as the lost decade. Most of Latin America um, began a process of extensive privatization as a result of the SAPs. Um, it also included a restriction in trade barriers and fiscal restraint, again, adopting these neoliberal reforms. Um, Initially, right, this significantly deepened poverty throughout Latin America, like we talked about. Um, Naturally, I got hair in my mouth. Naturally, uh, this produced a very strong political backlash. Okay. Um, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, they all elected leftist leaders. Okay. This was known as the pink tide. Um, Brazil and Argentina, they preserved a lot of the macroeconomic neoliberal foundations. Okay. But they implemented very deep um, social programs aimed at the poor. In particular, in Brazil, it was called Bolsa Familia. Um, Chavez in Venezuela, he intervened more heavily, subsidizing food and fuel, nationalizing those key industries such as minerals, right, including fuel, right? Um, and most were able to balance budgets, right? Through 2007, they achieved higher growth rates, greater fiscal surpluses than other Latin American governments, with only slightly higher inflation. So they did a pretty good job. Okay. Biggest reduction of poverty in generations in these specific countries. Brazil, um, inauguration of President Lula in 2003, and the democratization movement in the 1980s founded the Working Party that ruled Brazil from 2003 until 2016. Okay, so the bottom billion. Um, this is a notion where you have the population of the poorest countries left behind by globalization, mostly African. Okay. There's three approaches. The World Bank, um, stronger institutions, human capital, and public goods. Um, so the Millennium Development Goals targets established by the United Nations to reduce poverty and hunger, improve education, health, improve status of women, achieve environmental stability, sustainability, aid, solve problems. Um, Neoliberal, reduce aid, encourage markets, financing via global bond markets to discipline states. Okay, so these are the various approaches to deal with the bottom billion. Okay. Um, Now, just an aside, I've been on some of these Millennium Development Goal boards, um, and what they do is they get together various people from all over the world, from all walks of life, together to talk about specific problems in communities from all across the different countries, to decide and to talk about these various problems within communities, and to see how it might be best to address some of these issues and what they would like the United Nations to know about these specific issues and certain thoughts or ideas they might have about addressing these issues, right? And then the United Nations is supposed to work towards addressing these goals, right? Um, the World Bank is supposed to focus on creating stronger institutions, um, creating stronger human capital and public goods through things like education, better health, and stuff like that. Obviously, neoliberalism um, is what it is. Now, the IMF uh, and the World Bank, believe it or not, came out in 2015 and admitted that neoliberalism as a concept, as a policy, was an utter failure, right? Um, you can Google it and you'll find their reports that neoliberalism failed, right? And actually created more harm. Um, so, uh, what that means, we'll see. So, and austerity and all of that just caused more problems than it did good. Um, so, hopefully, they've learned from their mistakes. Um, there we go. So, anyway, that's that. There's this really interesting video about the bottom billion, but I don't think we have time. Uh, it's with this guy here, Paul Collier, who came up with the notion of the bottom billion. And this quote is interesting. He says, "Without an informed electorate, politicians will continue to use the bottom billion merely as for photo opportunities rather than for promoting real transformation." But he talks about how he came up with this idea through research in Africa and other places. But this is a really interesting video. Um, Regime type and development. So, which regime is more conducive to development? Democratic regimes are best because they have accountability, stability, and the rule of law. Um, Authoritarian regimes best because they resist political demands for consumption, investment instead, right? So these are the two ideas, right? So regime type and development. According to Brzezinski et al., democratic and authoritarian regimes are even on economic development. So democracies tend to use labor more efficiently than authoritarian regimes. In democracies, workers receive more benefits, okay, from the economy than authoritarian regimes. Institutions do matter because you have strong parties, elite unity, lack of ethnic politics, right? So there isn't a lot of ethnic conflict and excuse me, I'm sorry. In democracies, Pippa Norris in 2012, she talks about bureaucratic capacity is key. So, in other words, whether or not you have strong and effective bureaucracies, right? She says that this distinguishes between bureaucratic democracies, patronage democracies, bureaucratic autocracies, and patronage autocracies. She says bureaucratic democracies are best. Okay, so in other words, whenever you have patronage, that's bad. When you have, so like right now, we might be considered a patronage democracy, right? Because people are expected to pay homage to the executive, right? To stay at Trump hotels, to, you know, um, do things like uh, if you're a country, for example, um, uh, what was it that happened with Ivanka's stuff in China? I forget what it was. It was a couple of months ago. Um, Allow factories to do something. I forget what it was in relation to China, that was finally allowed relation to Ivanka's stuff, um, uh, in China, like that kind of thing, right? Announcing that a bunch of Saudi nationals are going to be staying at Trump hotels, like that kind of thing. That's patronage democracy, right? And that's one reason why we're not supposed to allow presidents to have so much stuff tied up, that much kind of connection, to their businesses, because if nothing else, gives that appearance of patronage. Um, so anyway, patronage is bad, bureaucratic, good. Okay. Mexico, what does this say here? I can't see. From protectionism to neoliberalism. Okay. So the economic model initially was ISI, and it shifted to neoliberalism, kind of like we talked about earlier in the 1980s to 90s. The development outcome, middle income country, heavy reliance on exports. Response to the Great Recession, it mirrors the US economy to a large extent. Recent reform efforts, liberalization of the energy sector. Um, Continuing problems, they have high inequality and dependence on US market and growing debt. All right, so China, an emerging powerhouse type of economy, developmental state with modifications. Um, Development outcomes, world's greatest economic growth and poverty reduction, slowing since 2013. We're starting to see a bit more growing income inequality, which is bad for them. Response to Great Recession, they had a stimulus plan, focus on infrastructure, continued but slower growth, now it's kind of going backwards. As far as from an economic perspective, recent reforms, expanding the private sector and liberalizing financial sector, but continued role for state-owned industries. Continuing problems, growing inequality, labor unrest, aging population, and environmental concerns. Obviously, they are one of the biggest polluters. Um, they have a major problem because of their pension programs related to um, the fact that people are obviously living longer. That's a problem that most of the world has, right? And because of the um, rapid sort of industrialization, um, they're having and growing income inequality, and also sort of fewer rights, and unsafe working conditions. They're having a significant amount of labor unrest that's going on there. Um, India, development and democracy, type of economy, elements of developmental state, but partial shift toward neoliberalism more recently. Developmental outcomes, they have rapid growth, as most of us know, in the new millennium, but very limited poverty reduction. Response to Great Recession, initial stimulus and growth, then collapse and high inflation. Recent efforts at reform, enhanced neoliberal policies, new social programs aimed at the poor. Continuing problems, largest population in poverty, and the most malnutrition in the world. Obviously, we're also seeing other problems related to this sort of fascism that's going on with Modi and all of that, and the problems related to Muslims in that country. And we're also seeing that in China as well, by the way. the racism and related to the Uyghurs and all of that. And they're being pushed out of the economy as well in both countries. Iran struggling with the blessings of oil, type of economy, oil dependent, development outcomes, good oil growth until 2011, some poverty reduction, response to Great Recession, dependence on oil revenue, increased debt, recent, oops, um, recent reform efforts, subsidy cuts, greater foreign investment after nuclear deal with the United States. Of course, now they're having problems because of the sanctions. Continuing problems, high inflation and unemployment, though that had started to reduce, and now is starting to rise because of sanctions, political pressure for subsidies, conservative resistance to foreign investment. Um, so, kind of like here, I've talked about previously, they have a sort of they have gridlock between the reformers and the government. The reformers represent the president, um, President Rouhani, and then I'm sorry, the conservative element being, the religious arm, right? And they, the religious arm, really doesn't trust the United States, just like the conservative arm of the United States does not trust Iran. And the reformers in Iran want closer ties with the West, um, just like the West would like closer ties with Iran, because the West believes that the way to reform Iran is to let people in, right? Which they would be right. Most Iran experts would agree with that. You reform from the inside out. Um, but anyway, I digress. So the conservatives resist foreign investment because they fear it, um, and perhaps they should. Um, but anyway, Nigeria, a weak state, oil and corruption, type of economy, oil dependent, development outcomes focused on oil revenue only, little other development, growth in the new millennium until 2014, response to Great Concession, continued oil growth until oil prices fell. Recent oil reforms reduced oil subsidies, fiscal stability, anti corruption policies under democratic regimes, continuing problems, falling oil prices, corruption. Right. So, um, again, when we talk about oil dependency, um, it's very much tied to corruption. Um, when you have uh, that much oil dependency, regimes can tend towards um, tend towards greater corruption, because they feel that they don't necessarily need the population, um, even if they might be trying to reform the state itself. Um, it's easier to try to line your pockets with that money than it is to um, try to, say, fix the regime itself, to end corruption, stuff like that. So it's been a difficult road in Nigeria in that regard. They've had a lot of fighting in regards to uh, different um, warlords and things like that in Nigeria. And they focused mainly on their oil revenue rather than fighting those elements. Anyway, that's the end of that. Next time, we're going to talk about the last chapter in this, uh, which will sort of tie in sort of all of these things that we've been talking about. Like we'll talk about healthcare and the welfare state and all of that. So, as far as announcements, what I wanted to talk about was, hold on a second. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. So I've launched a poll for you guys. So for those of you who are here, please take it. It's anonymous. I think I'm missing one. Oh, I'm that one person. Never mind. Okay, so everybody's taking that. Um, so this is how it would work. Um, I would um what I would do is since some of you want to keep it, didn't think you would. All right. Um, hold on. How about I'm thinking. Sorry. Um, Anybody have any suggestions or thoughts or comments?
So like by like replacing quizzes, you mean like how many like quizzes would you do then in place of the exam? Is that kind of what you meant? Like instead of having the exam, do like a couple quizzes?
Uh, yeah.
So like
Oh, I
how
thought
many?
I thought you meant that you were gonna like take our current quiz grades and count them as a final. So I would have changed my answer.
Yeah, well, so it'd be like this, right? So the quizzes that I haven't launched yet, I would launch them and you'd have 2 chances to do them, just like always.
Okay, and then that's like that would be considered the final then.
Yeah.
Okay,
Whereas the final, you don't have 2 chances to do it.
right. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm fine with the quizzes, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah, I was one of the votes for taking the final, but knowing that, I would probably change it to the quizzes.
Okay. All right. Good to know. All right, so now it's down to 3 to 13. Anybody else feel better about that? Who voted for keep final?
Well, I mean, the other thing too is like, I mean, I guess people could you do like both? Like, if somebody wanted to like do the final, let's like just let them take one, and then if you want to take the quizzes, like, or does it have to be like unanimous or what?
Doesn't have to be unanimous, but I'm just trying to make people feel better. I mean, because half the class isn't even here. So they're gonna have to
Right.
tough it out. Um, but you know, it would just make me feel better if people felt better about it. But so basically what it means is just that, you know, you take the quizzes like you always do, and you have 2 chances to do the quizzes. And you can take them at any time, right?
Right.
Whereas with the final, you know, I'm going to give you a couple days, but you only have 1 chance to do it, right? Um, and you know, there were some people who that didn't work out well for. You know, a lot of you, you know, some of you it did, but some of you it didn't, right? So I think that the better scenario is to take a couple of quizzes, like 4 quizzes, right? In 10 question increments, you know, where you have 2 chances each.
Yeah. Like, I think that's a good idea. And like maybe you could like put a thing up on like Blackboard or whatever, and like the
Right.
poll, and then see how many more like responses you get, because like maybe it'll be more if more people like participate. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. All right.
When's the
But
paper due?
Um, this Sunday.
This Sunday?
Yeah.
Can I get it? Can you email it to me like the like the format?
It's on Blackboard and it says paper info here. So like, hold on.
And that's just for extra credit, right?
Yeah. Hold on. wrong thing. Module 3, did I do it? I'm pretty sure it does. Yeah. So in module 2, see it says paper info recs can be found in this folder. And then when you scroll down, it's all right here.
Okay, I got it. Thanks.
What was the part about the extra credit? I
The paper has turned into extra credit.
gotcha.
Okay. So hold on just one second. The paper's extra credit, Cameron. Was that you, Cameron, that asked? Okay. Oh, okay. All right. So anyway, and so Yash, if you look here, there is like a thesis statement thing. There's also a paper skeleton that you can like copy out and fill in and then erase these things here when you're done. So hold on a second. Anyway, yeah,
Is that then due Sunday at midnight?
yeah,
Okay.
uh-huh. And then, you know, like you can take all of the quizzes that I'll launch them over a few days, up through until like next, um, like Thursday or Friday. I'll see which day it'll be, but one of those days. But if it's Friday, it would only be until like 9 o'clock or something like that at night because the grades are due at midnight, you know.
Is that next Friday?
Yeah, they're due the 8th.
Oh, really? So like semester, like when is like semester done? Is it like next week or what?
Yeah, it's done the 8th.
Okay, that's a lot earlier than I thought. Like I don't know what I was thinking, but
Yeah. So, so I need to have them done by then. So anyway, so if it's next Friday, then they would have to be done by like around like 9 o'clock at night. But if it's Thursday, it would be like by midnight. So I'll have it done by then. So by Friday night at midnight, your grades will be what you see is what they are.
okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I don't want anybody to stress out about your grades, honestly, because I mean, this whole thing has been like a nightmare for everybody, you know, me included. And like, you know, I'm not going to be like a total jerk about any of this stuff. You know what I mean? I'm really not. Um, you know, I, I mean, obviously, I'm making this paper, which to me is normally the most important like piece of the class for me from my perspective. I've turned it into extra credit, which I've never ever done before, ever. You know, I'm making the final exam disappear. You know, I'm trying to make it as easy as possible on everybody. You know, um, so and if you didn't do so great on the midterm, you know, the extra credit will definitely help, and I promise it'll really help, you know. And most of you did really great on the quizzes, and that's really going to help you. And you know, you're going to be okay. Everybody's going to be okay, you know. And if anybody's really worried for any reason, the university's offering the pass fail thing. Um, but and I think that um, it's like, uh, or is it the SU or whatever, right? And I don't see anybody in here getting anything less than a C, I don't think. If everybody completes all these pieces, that you need to do. So I think everybody's going to be okay, you know. But anyway, don't worry, guys. All right. Anyway, um, anybody have any questions specifically? Any, any concerns, worries? No? Okay. All right, then we'll talk next time on Friday. Okay. See you later, guys.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thank you.
No problem. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.